Professor, thank you very much to join us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Professor, nudge theory states that people usually choose the easiest option rather than the most suitable to them. Because of that, to do what is best for us, we need a nudge. So how do you avoid being biased when making a decision?
Okay, great. So one way to phrase it is that people are not perfect choosers. So often we don't need a nudge. When we're deciding what to order at a restaurant we know well, we probably don't need a nudge. If we're driving in our home neighborhood, we know how to get to the gas station or to the restaurant. We don't need a nudge. If you are in an unfamiliar place, you probably benefit from a GPS, which does nudge you. You can ignore it if you don't like the route it chooses, and you certainly get to choose your preferred destination. It doesn't tell you where you end up, but it nudges you to take a certain route. If you're driving in some automobiles and you start to turn into the next lane, there will be a beeping noise that's nudging you to be careful, make sure you're making the right decision. And sometimes when you're backing up and you're about to hit something, it will beep and tell you that you are about to hit something, and that is a nudge also. The examples I gave involve the fact that sometimes we don't have the information we need, as when we're in an unfamiliar city and trying to get from one place to another. And sometimes we might be inattentive. The case of the beeping is a result of imperfect attention on the part of human decision makers. It might be that if you have an allergy to, say, peanuts or shrimp, I have an allergy to shrimp, a nudge that informs you that the food you're about to choose has shrimp or nuts in it will be very welcome. The basic criterion for deciding on nudges in cases in which you're trying to help choosers to make better choices is whether it makes them better off as they themselves judge it. So the best way to counteract bias on the part of the nudger is to ask the nudger, what does the chooser want? And that's what a GPS does. That's what an allergy label does. And that's what most of the good nudges do. They help make people better off as judged by themselves.
The idea was so revolutionary that many politicians and governments have told you and to listen options to consider in which way this concept could be applied in public politics. Even David Cameron created in 2010 the nudge unit. And of course, you work very close with Obama. My question is, after this experience, what could be the most relevant balance that you can explain to us that finally governments has done with this idea in the practical life?
Well, thank you for that. The reason I think for the interest in nudging is that these are instruments or tools that can help governments do a better job without costing a lot of money. So if you're interested in occupational safety or in vaccination or in pandemic prevention or in climate change or in economic growth or in poverty reduction or in reducing discrimination, say on the basis of sex, you have with nudges an assortment of tools. My personal favorite example is from my own experience in the Obama administration, where there's a program that gives poor children access to free school meals, but a number of the families don't sign up. And this is people who are really poor, who are entitled to lunch and breakfast at school, and their families don't sign up. The program gives nutritious, healthy meals to children and can really make a difference in their lives. The nudge we introduced is one that automatically enrolls the children in the free school meals so that they don't have to sign up at all. It's automatic. they don't have to use the program if they don't want to. They can bring their own meals or refuse to eat. So they have freedom. The families have freedom to take advantage of the program or not as they see fit. But according to a recent number, this program and some very similar ones are giving 15 million children access to free school meals. And that's a very large impact. Another one I quite like has been used in Germany and Switzerland, where the interest in reducing pollution, including greenhouse gas emissions, is very strong. And a program used in both Germany and Switzerland, it can also be found in other countries, automatically enrolls both businesses and households in clean energy. Not coal, but instead solar or wind, for example. And the result has been to decrease pollution, including carbon emissions, very dramatically. And that's improving public health.
I'm going to ask you again if there is such a thing as a group bias when decisions are made as a group. And one of the most common mistakes when making group decisions happens.
Okay, so a group could be biased in the sense that it might be racist or sexist. And then if the individuals share a bias, the group could be biased. That's bias in the sense that ordinary language makes familiar. Bias against certain groups. Bias in the sense of behavioral science refers to cognitive bias, which is a systematic departure from what's true. So if people think that their preferred sports team is going to win, that's a form of bias. It's optimistic bias. If they are focused on today and tomorrow and not the long term, that's present bias. If the individuals are present biased, then the group is highly likely to be present biased also because the individuals are. Now, there's something a little more interesting than what I just said, which is that groups often amplify the bias of their individual members. So if you have a group of people who are, let's say, unrealistically optimistic, as they speak with one another, their optimism might grow. So if they're thinking, will Argentina win a very important football game? And the individuals in the group tend to think probably, and Argentina is admittedly phenomenal, so this might not be a bias, but let's just stipulate they're a little more optimistic even than reality warrants. As they talk to each other, they might shift from being pretty confident that Argentina will win the football game to thinking that it is inevitable and certain that Argentina will win the football game. And that's an example, without extraordinary importance to many government issues such as poverty reduction and climate change, though it may relate to those. I should say I'm a fan of Argentina in football. But if you're talking about some sort of policy, I am indeed. They're incredible. If you're thinking about public policy, if a group of officials are focused on the short term and not the long term, with respect to the economic health of the nation, that bias, present bias, might not just be replicated in the group, but it might be amplified in the group. And there's a lot of data suggesting that groups become more biased than their individual members in the same direction as their individual members, but more so.
Professor, the most difficult decisions that we have to take in our life, there are maybe when we have to choose a profession, when we decide to buy a house or getting married. There is and usually we don't have experience because it's just one time or two times, or well, maybe sometimes decisions, but it's not really usual. So my question is, there is a kind of nudge for these big decisions that we have to take and we don't have experience before?
Yes. So if you're buying a house for yourself, it might be the only time you're going to do it, or one of the few times you're going to do it. But there might be a lot of data available about home purchasing and what affects people's well-being after they do it. So to consult data might not be the most exciting thing in the world, but it might be essential to prevent error. So if it turns out that across a wide range of people in the relevant area, home prices typically go up over every 15-year period. So it looks like a good economic investment. That might turn out to be relevant. If it turns out that if you have data suggesting that people who purchased homes who are like you tend to be very glad that they did, 90% did, that would be very useful to know. To run some numbers about everything that can be turned into numbers can prevent people from leaping to a decision that might turn out to be imprudent, or from deferring a decision that might turn out to be extremely helpful. With respect to affairs or matters of the heart, like marriage, to rely on data probably isn't feasible and might not be consistent with the nature of the enterprise. But I'll tell you a story which shows you both sides of the coin, which is I was in a group of men a number of years ago. There were about 6 of us, and one said that he knew within a week of meeting his now wife that he wanted to marry her. And he said that with some awe and wonder. And he was very happily married, and said he knew within a week and it was right. And one of the friends in the group said, if I had married every woman whom I knew in a week that I wanted to marry, I would have 17 ex-wives. So the
different nudges.
Whether the first guy is representative of humanity or whether the second guy is representative of humanity, I don't have data on that.
Professor, I want to ask you, you said that COVID or the pandemic doesn't change our mind structure in terms of how our mind works, because it's something that happened, but that it doesn't change our mind. I'm going to ask you what happened with technology consumption. There is something that really can change our structure, because it's, I mean, there is some studies, probably I need to check more about it, that said that this native digital generation is the first generation with a lower IQ than their parents. I don't know if it's true, and maybe it's correlative, and we can say that it's because the mobiles, the internet addiction, or wherever. But my question is this new consumption that we have with the technology, and even the metaverse that Mark Zuckerberg announced a few weeks ago, could change for worse, for better, or what would happen with our mind structure to take decisions?
Okay, so there are some really interesting empirical questions here, and I don't have the data. So is the question whether COVID has changed our minds? It's a nice pun, which is it's changed our minds about health risks. So people who were formerly very dismissive of the risk of pandemics, and even in the early weeks, the risks of COVID, they have changed their minds about COVID. Has their mind changed neurologically? I don't know if there's data on whether people who've had COVID have some neurological impact that lasts. That's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that. It would be surprising, at least to me, if people who've had COVID typically have long-term neurological changes, but it would be unsurprising to me if some people who've had COVID have long-term neurological changes. So that's an intriguing empirical question. With respect to social media and whether it changes the human brain, this is an empirical question on which I don't know the data. It would be surprising to me, very, if there was a aggregate reduction in IQ for a whole generation that was attributable to social media. That just would be a surprise. But life does have surprises in it. What we do know something about, I want to be careful about the neuroscience, but there's recent work suggesting that social media is addictive. in the sense of that social scientists and others use the word addictive. And that is highly likely to have a neurological component, though it's observed in behavior. So that's interesting. What to do with that is a very nice and difficult question.
Professor, how do you change your personal life when you realize the concept of nudge in your daily life? Can you offer one example about that?
Well, one example, a number of years after nudge, but not a wildly large number of years after nudge, involves my son. So the book talks about econs and humans, and where econs are perfectly rational and humans aren't. And my son, he was now 12, when he was about 7, so that was about 10 years after, maybe less, maybe it was about 7 years after the publication of Nudge. Whenever we passed a toy store, he'd want to go in. And this got a little disruptive because we lived in a town that had a toy store that we would pass. And so I said to him, Declan is his name. I said, there are 2 families of cognitive operations in your mind. There's the econ and there's the human. And I said, the econ is system 2. It's deliberative and reflective. It knows that you have enough toys and going into another toy store really isn't worthwhile. You just get a toy that you won't care about the next day. Whereas the humans, system 1, is very focused on the toy and needs the toy now. And you should counteract your system 1, which wants to go in the toy store, with your more deliberative and reflective system 2. Any good father would have that conversation with a 7-year-old, yes. But this did affect my personal life. And for a few weeks, it worked in the sense that he was less interested in going into toy stores. But after a few weeks, he turned to me and said, Daddy, do I even have a system 2?
That's great. That's great. Professor, you also has wrote another book called Slot. Is what stops us from getting things done and what to do about it. Can you share with us what is the sludge? Because it's not just a simple inconvenience, some pain. It's something more dangerous that really can affect our lives. Can you explain to us, George, the concept of the sludge?
Yes, think of sludge as frictions that stand between people and something that can make their lives go better. It might be bureaucracy, where you have to talk to 7 people to get something to happen. It might be some online form you have to fill out, which is so complicated and confusing that you fail and start to cry. It might be that you have to go into some place to get vaccinated or to get some card of some kind, and it's hard to find the place. And once you get there, there's an extremely long line, or someone who speaks to you in the following way when you ask them, how do I get the card? And they say, what card? Or we're about to close. And this kind of friction, which is sometimes imposed by private companies, sometimes imposed by governments, can make people feel that their dignity has been ignored, make people feel frustrated and humiliated, and that's really terrible. And also impose a time tax on people, and that time tax can be very high, and also can be like a wall that separates people from something to which they have a right. And so the war on sludge, which is starting in 2021, I hope, it will take a few years, but this is an honorable and good war.
Professor, what is the most frequent mistake that, or the most frequent questions that the businessman ask you about the nudge dangers that we have because the bias or what is the most frequent question that very important businessman has asked you
Well, they
about the
basically
decision,
want
making decisions. Yeah.
in business, in government now, so I don't work with businesses, but when I was a civilian, there were two things businesses were interested in. First, how do we use nudges to make more money? And second, how do we use nudges to do better as a member of society? So I think knowing what I was interested in, businesses were more frequently going to ask, and did frequently ask, how can we promote public health? How can we increase safety? How can we help our consumers not make economically foolish decisions? Those were the most common, but I frequently was asked, how can we sell more of our product?
Professor, thank you very much because we are on time. We don't like to stall your time. And it would be great if you came back to Argentina once. We can play sports. You're a professional, also professional. I can do my best, but we can enjoy.
That's great. I played football in high school. I was a fullback. I wasn't very good. But it wasn't very good, but I wasn't horrible, and I liked it a lot.
Professor, thank you very much again.
Thank you. Great pleasure.